Okay, so I'm going to spend today's class talking about data centers and cloud computing. The next homework that's going to come out shortly, due after the exam, not before, is going to be on cloud computing and Amazon EC2, just to get you familiar with EC2. And nothing fancy, just some basic stuff that you can do on EC2 to start up VMs and things like that. So, because that homework is going to be out soon, I'm going to do this topic out of order. Typically, this is a special topic that comes towards the end, but the background here helps with the homework, so I'm going to do that here. Right. So we'll talk about data centers first, and then cloud computing. So, what are data centers? So, they are essentially large server and storage farm. It's a facility that houses thousands of machines and storage associated with those machines. Uh, and these are built by companies to house either their own applications for their users, or they may be built in the case of the cloud by a company that wishes to rent out its servers or storage to other application providers. So, internet companies such as Google, Facebook, Microsoft, any company that provides a very large service to its users uses these data centers. Okay? Companies like banks use data centers to house their own applications, online banking or financial applications, and so on. Okay? So they can be used. The servers can be used for any purpose, any client server application, any internal use. It could be data processing use, hosting web services, online services, running business applications, and so on. Yes, I'll show some pictures in just a moment, but I wanted to distinguish between how the data center architectures and technologies are changing over the years. Okay? Traditionally, the data center architecture was static. You bought some servers, maybe several racks of them. Okay? You decided what applications ran on those servers, and administrator configured the machines, configured the application, and that was it. And there was some storage attached to this. This could either be a network storage, such as a storage area network, or it could be built-in storage where the storage is directly attached to the servers. But the architecture was static in that applications ran on the servers for long periods of times. There was less reconfiguration going on for any purpose. Okay, so this was how data centers are evolved traditionally. But today's data centers are more dynamic. Okay? First of all, they're bigger in that you have a lot more servers, lot more cores on these servers. Okay? The applications may be virtualized, meaning that there are virtual machines running on these physical servers, and applications run inside these virtual machines. And because your virtualization, there's a flexible mapping from the use of virtual resources to physical resources, which also means that you can bring up servers, virtual servers, shut them down, move them from one machine to another, resize them, and so on. I'll explain all of that in a couple of slides. But basically, more dynamic, okay, larger scale, more dynamism, also more automation. Okay, if your size of the system keeps growing, either you have to have more administrator to manage the larger system, or you have more automation so the system can manage some of the easier task itself without any human intervention. Okay, so one thing we have not looked at in the course of this distributed systems class is automation. Okay, we have assumed that the techniques are used for any purpose, but when you automate them, and they are actually being implemented without any human intervention. That's an important aspect of data center architecture. Okay. So here is a picture of one of the many data centers. So what you see here is basically a giant warehouse, okay, a very large building which has racks of these servers. So if you think of this as a equivalent to a supermarket, except that the aisles are filled with server racks, not products. Okay, that's basically the right analogies of that. Large ones can be much bigger than a typical supermarket sized facility, and they would have lots and lots of servers, hundreds of thousands or millions of servers. So there are racks. The racks have server storage on them, and what goes along with the compute infrastructure is there's a big cooling infrastructure. The servers, when they run, they produce a lot of heat. Okay, so an important aspect of data center design, which we have not looked at in the context of distributed system, is how to cool them efficiently. You need large amounts of air conditioning or chiller facility to cool these servers. In fact, the design of the cooling infrastructure happens to be just as important as the design of the compute infrastructure, because as we will see, typically for every watt of power that your server is going to take, you may need up to a watt to cool it. So your power bills are going to double. It's not that you just buy the servers and plug them in. You need as much power to cool the heat that is generated by the servers as the servers themselves. Okay? That can significantly increase the cost of building a large data center. Okay? Both in terms of the amount of investment you have to make to put in a cooling infrastructure, as well as your monthly electricity bills. Okay? So big aspect of data center design has been how to reduce your cooling costs, just as how you can reduce your server costs by using technical technologies like virtualization. Developing efficient cooling technologies is also an important area from a data center perspective. It's not a topic we have studied here. Okay? This topic involves partly mechanical engineering, where you look at mechanically cooled systems and other things like that, as well as computer science techniques to efficiently cool only parts of the data centers and so on. Okay, so cooling infrastructure, big aspect of data center design. We'll come back to that. Okay. The other things you need in a data center are you need a power infrastructure to power these servers. And if the servers are running anything that is important, then you also need a backup facility. Okay, the server, because if you lose your primary source of power, all the servers will go down. Okay, typically, what you will need is backup generators or some sort of batteries or some other form of storage to keep the servers running, UPS facilities to keep the server running. Okay, so designing the data center is more than just buying some computing infrastructure and putting them in and powering them. There's a lot of other things you have to do. Design efficient cooling infrastructure, design a reliable power infrastructure so that the power doesn't fail, meaning the servers don't go down if the power fails, there are backup sources and so on. And so all of this are aspects of data center design. Okay. Here is a picture that shows you a very different way of designing data centers. Okay. These are referred to as modular data centers. Okay. Essentially what is shown here, and these are shipping containers. Okay. These are containers like what you see on these 18-wheelers, okay, the trucks that you see on the freeway. So they are 40-foot long containers. Okay. And the racks are actually inside those containers. They're not actually in a building like a supermarket style store facility. They are actually inside a shipping container that you basically bring and you deploy in your data center. And now you can ask, why do it this way as opposed to maybe what you saw in this picture, which was just you put up some racks and you put up servers on these racks. So this architecture is referred to as a modular data center. Okay, first of all, you can see that these may not even be inside a building. They may be actually in open environment. You can see that this is just open space. There is some cooling that is attached to it. And the way you go about designing this is they are also plug and play. It allows you to grow your data center in units of one container at a time. A container may have, let's say, 2 racks and up to maybe 1,000 servers. So you buy 1,000 servers at a time, an entire container shows up, and then you simply bring it, you just plug it in, okay, meaning that you can think of this as it's pre-configured with everything. All you have to do is plug in power, plug in a network, and plug in a vent to basically cool the data, so cool that rack, and you're done, you're ready to go. Okay. So this is the first thing it is going to do, is it is going to reduce your deployment time and cost. So the time to actually build and deploy data center is significant. Think of it, if you have a large data center, let's say put in 100,000 servers. Okay. If you do it the usual way, you order 100,000 servers, they'll come in 100,000 boxes. You have to unbox them, you have to rack them, you have to cable them. Okay, you have to do this 100,000 times, one for each machine, and that has to be done by some human. Okay. So even after your center is ready to go, just deploying the servers can take months of time. Right? On the other hand, if you just, instead of ordering individual servers, if you order a container from a vendor, vendors actually sell containers of servers now, not just individual servers. The servers are pre-populated, pre-cabled by the vendor. So the data center provider doesn't have to do anything. It comes pre-configured. okay, not pre-configured, pre-installed on racks and cabled and so on. All you have to do is just plug it in and it is ready. It also reduces your cost because it is pre-engineered for efficient cooling and so on. You don't have to decide how to design your vents and so on inside your data center. Each module has its own infrastructure that the vendor has designed to cool as efficiently as possible. Okay. So many large providers of data centers are going to this modular model. It also allows for incremental growth. You want to expand the size, you just buy more containers and they arrive and then you just plug them in. Okay. That's a picture of an actual data center. That's not a warehouse with a random shipping containers. Those are actually data centers that have been stacked one on top and actually used for compute purposes. So many companies are building this form of data centers now, which is more modular. Okay, it allows for growth, is easier to deploy and so on. Okay. So as far as that's about the hardware aspect of data center design architectures. Now from a software perspective, most modern data centers use some form of virtualization. We have looked at virtualization already and you have some idea of how it works. So here is an example of how you can use virtualization in a data center environment. So let's assume you have a physical server. You have racks and racks of this, but on each physical server, you have a hypervisor, a virtualization layer running. What this hypervisor allows you to do is, it allows you to slice the physical resources on this server across multiple virtual machines. Each virtual machine is like a virtual server. It looks exactly like a physical machine. You can run whatever OS and application you want in them. So I think there's some animation here. Okay, so here you should see an example where you have two virtual machines running on this physical server. One is running a Windows OS, another is running a Linux OS, and it runs some arbitrary application. Okay? So each VM looks like a server, it can run its own application. Now what virtualization allows you to do is a more dense packing of servers onto the hardware of your data center. Okay, if each of those machines were a physical server, you would need a lot more physical machines to run the same number of applications. But because servers are becoming more powerful, they may have lots of cores. Well, let's say you can buy 16 or 32 core servers. Most applications may not need that amount of computational power. Okay, so you may be simply wasting a lot of the resources on the server. So a better way to use those resources is to slice that physical or logically partition that physical server into smaller virtual servers. Each could be given, let's say, 4 cores and some amount of memory, and then you run whatever application you want on it. So that's a better way to use your resources in a data center, especially for applications or server applications that don't need all of the resources on these more powerful machines. So virtualization allows you to more efficiently use resources. It also allows you to dynamically adjust resource allocations on the fly. Okay, here you are shown a scenario where there is equal partitioning. There's a server and it's equally partitioned. That's what the picture seems to indicate. Equal partitioning of resources. Now let's say the needs of one of these virtual servers increases, becomes more compute intensive. It is possible to give it more resources on the physical machine, either if there are more idle resources or if this VM is not using all of its resources, you can reallocate on the fly. Okay? This is something you could not do on a physical server. You can't just give whatever resources are there are already being used. You can't give it more resources than what is already present. But since the virtual servers are given a fraction of the resources, the fraction can be varied over time. Okay. Even more importantly, if the needs of this a certain virtual machine go up and there are no idle resources, you can move that virtual machine onto other servers. Okay, so that is called virtual machine migration. We looked at that when we did process migration earlier in the course. So here we see that that VM1, the orange VM, needs more resources. So you can then move it to another physical machine. Okay, in this case, what has happened is the smaller VM has been moved, and then what you can do is dynamically resize that VM and give it more resources if it needs to. Okay. So you can perform these optimizations that you couldn't do on physical servers. Okay, those are some of the advantages. So here you just see some hypervisors, which many of you may know already. There's VMware is a commercial hypervisor manufacturer. There's Parallels, another commercial product. Zen, KVM, VirtualBox are all examples of either type 1 or type 2 hypervisors that are more open source. Okay, so you can just use them on any machine without paying for them. Okay, so virtualization is popular, and there are many. I already showed many advantages of using virtualization, mainly resource allocation, but there are other use cases here. Okay. So the three here are: first is server consolidation. That's an important advantage in data centers that use virtualization. Okay, what often happens is servers have lifetimes of 3 to 5 years. After 3 or 5 years, the server becomes too old. You replace it with newer hardware. Okay? Now, in 5 years' time, the hardware that you buy to replace an old server will be a lot more capable than the old hardware. Okay? 5 years ago, for instance, you could only buy single core machines, okay, or you had multi-processor machines with two processors. So that was the norm. Today, if you buy a server, you will either get 4, 8, or 16 cores. Okay? Now, if you do one-to-one replacement, you are giving the same old application maybe 6 or 8 times the amount of resources than it needs. Okay? So what is often done is what is referred to as server consolidation, where you replace one new server for every 4 old servers. Okay? Because you have each server is 4 times more capable than a server you bought 5 years ago. You don't need to do one-to-one replacement. You can take many old servers and replace that with one new server that is going to be just that capable. And then what you do is you virtualize your server and take that newer server and make 4 virtual servers out of it and deploy your applications on those 4 virtual servers. So it gets the same amount of resources as it had gotten earlier, except that now you have a smaller hardware footprint for your entire application set. So that is an important advantage of using virtualization. It's often done in data centers. Okay. Now, the flip side of it is the compute needs of enterprises are also growing. So it is not that every 5 years the number of servers you have is shrunk by a factor of 4 because you did server consolidation. In fact, you have new applications that you deploy in that time period. So you still buy the same number of servers, but you then have a lot more applications to deal with. That complicates system administration and so on. That's one advantage, server consolidation. The other one is faster deployment, okay, because you have virtualized applications. You can create virtual machines, you can have virtual disk and just deploy them quickly. Okay, if you have any experience with virtualization, you will know what I'm referring to. If you can deploy a virtual machine much faster than installing a physical machine from scratch by installing the OS and installing the application and so on. You can have pre-configured virtual machines that you can just simply copy onto a virtual physical machine and boot it up as a VM, for instance. Okay, that is speeds up deployment time. And the claim is that to some extent, using virtualization will reduce maintenance costs. I would say that is not necessarily a given because virtualization itself adds another layer to your software stack. Your virtualization layer, your OS, and then your applications. So there are some additional overhead in managing virtual machines, but to some extent, because you can dynamically allocate resources, the maintenance of the servers may be simplified in certain scenarios. So those are for server class applications. Data centers are also used increasingly for desktop class applications. So what happens in this case is you have your clients, typical end clients, which are PCs or laptops. Rather than giving a regular PC or laptop to your employees, what many organizations are doing is they simply deploy a virtual machine for every employee. Deploy your PC onto that virtual machine. Okay? And you give your employee a thin client. A thin client is a less capable machine. It could simply be a tablet-like machine, or it could be a low-end PC. All that PC is doing is connecting to this back-end virtual machine, which is where the real computation is happening. Okay. So this kind of infrastructure is referred to as a virtual desktop infrastructure, or VDI. Okay. Many large companies are employing this architecture rather than giving a full-fledged machine to every employee. Now, why do this? The reason is that in large organization, you may have 10,000 employees, 50,000 employees, 100,000, lots of employees. And if you give a desktop to each employee, you have to have an administrative staff to manage such a large desktop infrastructure. Okay. On the other hand, if you consolidate all of these onto a data center, all of your PCs, or virtual PCs in this case, are co-located in a data center. So the management is now centralized. It's not spread across your dozen branch offices you may have across a country, for instance. Okay, all your employees may just dial in to some VPN and then connect to your virtual PCs. Okay, so you can deploy security patches or do upgrades. All of that can be centralized. Okay. For many kinds of applications, this works very well. So think of a supermarket teller who's checking you out. They have a PC-like device that is being used to check you out. Okay, but now if you deploy infrastructure of this sort, then the maintenance of that can be centralized. You don't actually have to go and do anything at each of the checkout counters, for instance. And they don't need a full-fledged PC. All that machine is doing is running a checkout application that is simply scanning what products are being purchased and giving you a bill. For this kind of scenario, this works well. Now, this may not work well if you're a software developer that is doing trying to build a very large let's say application on your desktop where you need a lot of computational power. In that case, the regular model is better. But for many scenarios, this kind of infrastructure works very well. Okay, so desktops are now virtualized. They're put in a back-end data center. You use remote access through thin clients. Okay. So there are many cloud providers that also do this. Okay, you can actually go rent a PC on the cloud, and they allow you to connect to that PC through a thin client application. Okay, your PC, all the files are actually stored in the cloud, for instance. Okay, so that's the hardware-software architecture. So there are many challenges when you design a data center, both hardware and software challenges. I'm just going to outline some of them. We won't necessarily look at solutions for all. So biggest challenge is resource management. Right? You have lots of machines, lots of applications. You have lots of virtual machines. How do you manage them effectively without needing a very large number of system administrators? And because adding large system administrator staff is also going to cost a lot of money to an enterprise. Okay, so how to use your server and storage resources effectively is an important problem. Okay. What goes with that is many applications have unpredictable needs. If everything were predictable, you could do this efficiently. You could figure out this application can run on this server. I give it so much RAM, you give it so much CPU, and that application performs satisfactorily. Okay. But in many cases, the workloads that are seen by the applications are also unpredictable. Okay. Think of typical e-commerce websites. If you have an online store that is exposed to any arbitrary users, okay, and you start a sale, okay, let's say it's some July 4th or a Memorial Day sale, you cannot control or predict accurately the amount of traffic that may come in. Maybe your sale is a big success. Okay? Lots of users show up, your website is going to crash under overload because there are not enough resources. Or you may say, I expect a lot of users to come in and you provision a lot of servers for your website and nobody comes in. Okay, because it just doesn't work very well and then you wasted a lot of resources. Okay? So you cannot predict for many applications like these, what kinds of workloads will you see, how much resources to allocate. If you go and over provision, you may waste resources. If you may under provision, your server may buckle under overload. Okay, that makes those dynamics makes resource allocation very hard. If it's a regular application which is very predictable, this is not a problem. But many of these internet-facing applications are unpredictable inherently. And then if you want to also automate some of this resource management, that makes it even more challenging. You can't have a person watching every website trying to figure out, is it going to get overloaded, should you allocate more resources and so on. That simply will not scale when you have systems of this size. Okay, so you want to automate, but how do you automate well? How do you decide when This website may need more resources, you resize that virtual machine. All of these tasks are complicated and they make the resource management task more challenging. Okay? So that's one big challenge. The other one is energy efficiency. So I already alluded to this earlier, where I said when you have lots and lots of servers, they're going to consume a lot of power. Typical data center may need uh, 10 to 100 megawatts of power. A large data center need up to 100 megawatts. That is enough to power a small city, 100 megawatts of power. Okay, that's what one data center may take. Okay, now you can compute the amount of energy bills you're going to get every month if you consume 100 megawatts of power monthly. Okay, so making your facility energy efficient is a big challenge, okay, for data center providers. And there are two aspects of this. One is how do you make the servers themselves more energy efficient, and then how do you make the cooling of the servers more energy efficient. Server energy efficiency, well studied topic. Okay, there are a lot of computer science papers. If you just go search server efficiency, you'll see lots of papers on this. Okay. Which say things like if the server is not maxed out, it is consuming, not consuming, it is gonna has low levels of utilization. You can use power management techniques that are built in the hardware to reduce its power usage. The server is idle, for instance, in the night, the loads may be low. You can shut down some fraction of the servers in your data center. Okay, you can use these ideas to reduce the energy efficiency of servers. We will come back to this in a subsequent class when we talk about green computing. Okay? But so this is one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is the cooling infrastructure. Okay? How do you cool whatever servers are on? Okay? How do you cool them efficiently? Okay? And that's also not an easy challenge because your air conditioners have to be made smart. Okay? You cannot continue to pump a lot of cold air into your data center if the servers are not running. It will overcool. Okay? And given the size of these facilities, if only some of the servers in some part of the data centers are running and not others, you want to cool efficiently, saying only pump cold air into that part of the data center but not in others. So people have looked at techniques like this. There are more advanced techniques that say don't even use air conditioners. Right? Use open air to cool. Okay, so there are data centers that are built by companies like Facebook and Google that have done away with air conditioners completely. Okay. They are located in colder climates, okay. And because the climates are relatively cold, you can exhaust your hot air out and just draw outside air, which is cooler, in, and just run the servers at room temperatures. You don't have to cool it and make it freezing inside your data center. You just run the servers at somewhat higher temperatures. So in this case, you just need a way to exhaust hot air and bring in outside air, which is hopefully cooler than the air that you pumped out. So if you engineer a data center this way, you can reduce your cooling cost significantly. You don't need expensive air conditioners which themselves consume a lot of power. So the most modern data centers actually use some notion of outside air cooling. So there are some technologies called evaporative cooling where you use outside air to cool water and then you circulate the water and then use the water to cool the air, or you simply just take outside air, don't condition it too much and then pump it and then exhaust the hot air out. Okay. So those are some techniques that data center providers use. Okay. The third challenge, which I did not allude to much at all, is on the reliability front. Okay, we have talked about this when we were talking about fault tolerance in large distributed systems. Okay, so there is a lot of text there, but the most important takeaway is that when you have lots of components, okay, failure is going to become the norm, not the exception. Some fraction of your components will be down. Okay, we talked about this saying if P is the probability that a component does not fail, okay, then the probability that any one machine is down or any one component is down is 1 minus P to the power n, where n is the number of components. As n goes to infinity, your probability that some component fails will be going 10 to 1. Okay. So if you have a 10,000, 100,000 server data center, you have to assume that several hundred of these machines will be down on any given day for any particular reason. Either they have experience a hardware failure, a software failure, or they may be down for maintenance or some other reasons. Now, how do you design your distributed system so that you do not have your entire system go down even if some fraction of the servers are down or some fraction of the storage is down? Okay, that's an important reliability challenge. Okay. What is shown here is simply some statistics from a real data center that Google published. In the first year of some data center that they commissioned, these are all the things that actually happened. Okay. 0.5% of the servers overheated and died. Okay. The cooling was not sufficient or the hardware was faulty. Okay. There was one PDU failure. PDU is a unit that supplies power to a rack. Okay. If the PDU fails, okay, some number of servers that it is powering is going to go down. Okay. Here, this PDU was a large PDU. It's powered up to 500 servers. They went down. Okay. If you have to move a rack for any reason, okay, this is not a failure in particular, but for some reason you need to take some machines from one rack and put them on another rack. Okay. This may take another several hours to do, because this is a physical move, and some number of machines go down. This happens commonly where you say you want these machines to be on some other part of the data center where they're part of a larger pool. So you have deployed them in one place, you may have to move them. Okay. So this will take down some several hundred machines. If you need to rewire any aspect of your rack, that will again take down some fraction of your data set. Okay, so if you want to upgrade the routers or the switches, which also happens, you don't just upgrade your machines, you upgrade the network infrastructure. Okay, so some fraction of your machines will go down. These are not necessarily real failures, they're maintenance outages. Okay, some of these things. Okay. 20 of their racks failed for some reason, and nobody could figure out why. And each rack took down about 40 machines, and then you need to reboot. Okay. There are 8 network maintenance outages. Okay. Each of them cost 30 minutes of downtime for some fraction of the data center. 12 routers, they got overloaded, DNS went down. Okay. So now the network, the software is up, hardware is up, okay, but the network connectivity to the machines have gone down because the router is misbehaving. Okay. Another kind of it. So this is router reload, this is router failures. Okay, DNS disappears for every once in a while. 1,000 other machines failed. Thousands of disks on the machines failed. Okay. This is 1 year of a data center's operation. These are all the kinds of things that administrators would have to deal with. Okay. So every day some disk is being replaced, some machine is overheated, is getting some replacement. Okay, some wires are being rerouted, some router needs to be rebooted. Okay, large infrastructure basically means you have these kinds of headaches. Okay. Now, if you are seeing this kind of dynamics, you have to ask, how do you build a reliable software infrastructure? So despite all of this that may be happening in the background, your user shouldn't see any outages. You can't have the applications actually go down even though all of this may be happening. Okay, if you do, then your users are not happy, especially if you're running something users care about. If users can't get to their mail, they may get very unhappy. Okay, if they cannot send instant messages, they also get unhappy. Okay, if you cannot access your money, you are even more unhappy if your bank goes down. Okay, so all of these are problems you have to deal with. So these are the kinds of challenges one have to deal with. Okay? And you don't actually have very good idea of how to design very reliable systems even in the presence of these kinds of failures. Only some small number of companies do that on a routine basis, like Google and Microsoft and so on. Most others will not actually be able to deal with this level of failures. They will actually see outages, and this is why you see outages every so often, because you are running on a data center that is not designed to deal with this kind of failures. Yes.
So the problem I think here is more exacerbated because Google is known to use really cheap quality hardware.
Yes.
So some of these like 1,000 hard drives failing in 1 year may not be realistic. So the problem, I mean, it might have been blown out of proportion because of their hardware usage.
Okay. So there are 2 points. There's a good point being made. First point is Google builds very large systems, but they use very cheap hardware just to keep the cost down. Okay, because you build very cheap hardware, the hardware may be less reliable. That may be true. They actually engineer their hardware well, but it is indeed cheap, and cheap hardware may not be as reliable as more expensive hardware. That's one point. The second point I would say is this is what they saw in their first year. So what you also see is when you buy very new hardware, you have what is called burn-in time. So if you look at a typical failure profile of any piece of hardware that you buy, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't have to be a computer. It could be a car. It could be a television. Okay, you will see that you can have a high probability of failure at the very beginning because the machine has not been fully tested. So some component may misbehave and it may actually go down. Okay, so that's referred to as burn-in time. Okay. Once the machine is known to function well, then it has a very stable failure rate, okay, which is fairly low. And then as the machine gets old, its failure probability shoots up because now parts are beginning to die. Okay. So at the very beginning of the life cycle and end of the life cycle of any hardware, you see the maximum failure rate, either because at the beginning some things are not tested well, so you plug it in and something blows. Okay. The hard disk may actually die because it is being burnt in, for instance. Because when somebody was racking it in, there was too much shaking and the hard disk had a problem. So you may have all sorts of problems. So I don't know what the second year stats look like, whether these numbers actually got better because all of these initial teething problems were resolved. But this is what happened in the first year. So it could have been because they picked cheap hardware, it could be because there was burn-in happening. Okay? And the other thing to keep in mind is this is a very large data center. 1,000 disks may look like a lot, but if you have 100,000 or a million servers, that's less than 1%. Okay? So it may be a fairly small number. Yeah, this is a very big facility, I think, that they were putting these numbers on. Okay, so you have to take it as a percentage, it may be very small. Okay, but I don't know what the actual numbers are. They don't tell you what the size of their facilities are. Any other questions here? Reliability. Okay, so that is, those are reliability calls. These are simply some other numbers on operational and capital expenses. So I won't actually go into all of these aspects of the pie chart, but what the two things to keep in mind is the initial capital investment for building a data center is going to be high. Okay. Large data centers may cost billions of dollars. UMass and some other universities have just recently built a data center in Holyoke, a small size data center. It costs $80 million. Okay. So that is a data center that can house about 10,000 or so servers. Yeah, that's $80 million over a 20-year lifespan. So that's quite a bit of money to build a data center. Right? Large one costs up to billions of dollars. Okay? So that's a big capital investment. Once you're paid that high capital investment, there are recurring monthly costs. Okay? Most of those come as energy bills. Okay? So large data centers may have electricity bills that run into millions of dollars a month. Okay, if you think of an electricity bill shows up, you have to pay several $1 million. That's quite a bit of money to pay. Okay. So those are the two areas that have seen the most attention. How do you reduce the capital cost of building a large facility? How do you reduce the operational cost of the monthly cost? The monthly cost has typically been somehow you have to have a low energy footprint. Shouldn't consume as much electricity or waste any electricity that you don't need to use at any given time. And how do you build this server hardware efficiently? So this goes back to the earlier comment that the reason Google buys cheap hardware is they treat a hardware as almost a disposable unit. Okay? It is far too expensive to go and repair a machine when you have 100,000 machines. It is much easier to just unplug, throw it out and plug a new one in. You're up and running much faster than you unplug it, you open it, you replace some motherboard. That may take hours of somebody's time. Okay? A machine may itself cost $1,000. You waste 6 hours of somebody's time to actually fix it. You're paid $600 of that person's salary in fixing the machine. Okay? So they basically try to engineer it for low cost. Okay? Not that it's less reliable, but then they don't even necessarily replace it in many cases. They just let it, mark it as dead and leave it there. If an entire rack fails, then you replace the rack. Okay? It's much cheaper than sending somebody to unplug a machine and plugging a machine. So how to deal with all of these reliability issues and reduce your operational costs results in some interesting observations or interesting design decisions. Saying why bother replace a machine? Just mark it as dead. Or why repair it if even if you unplug it? Just throw it out and put in a new one. Okay, and don't even bother. So these are all ways by which they have tried to eke out some small savings here and there and eventually get some good gains. Okay. So with respect to building data centers, larger is cheaper because you get economies of scale. Okay, the larger you make your facilities, the per server cost that you pay is cheaper because you can lower the price of buying in bulk. Okay. Very large data center providers don't even buy, they build their own hardware. Okay, they simply provide some specs, and rather than going to a vendor, they go to a contract manufacturer, say, I want 100,000 of these, make it as per this design. Because the order is so large that you can get it custom built. Okay? And even if you save $10 per server, if you have 1 million servers, okay, you are saving $10 million. Okay? Just as an example. So that gives you a significant boost in your cost structure. The other thing you have to do when you have large number of machines is automation, which means you need a fairly small number of actual people running your machines, managing the software on the machines. You want to have intelligent software that manages most of the routine tasks. Okay? When we talk about cloud computing, I'll come back to this automation issue. Okay? As I said, the usual trend is towards very large data center. Hundreds of thousands of servers is now not even considered large. Okay? You can have millions of cores in a data center. Okay? All of these trends have also resulted in the popularity of cloud computing. Because if you are a small company, right, you cannot afford to build a large data center, first of all. Okay? You may not have the money. And secondly, if you build a small facility, you may not get the economy of scale benefits. Okay? So then why not let someone else build a large data center and rent you a small fraction of it for your own computing needs? So they have extracted the economies of scale. You don't have to build your own facility and you can get it cheaper than building it. Okay? That is the rationale that has led to the rise of cloud computing platforms, which are essentially gigantic data centers that you can actually lease some fraction of those resources for your own need. Okay, so what we'll do for the rest of the class is talk about cloud, but I'm going to pause here for just a minute and see if there are questions on data centers first. Okay, so we just gone through some material quickly. Yes.
You said so. In the case of Google, they can handle those failures. That means like if I were renting a VM from Google, and if that rack goes down, do they have enough that my machine would actually still be operating somehow? Do they like make replicas, or
Okay.
would individual users see?
Okay, so you are asking a slightly different question. So when I said Google has designed techniques to build a reliable service, I was referring to the services they offer, not. So Google also runs a cloud. Okay, you can go and rent machines from Google and run whatever you want on their infrastructure. But what I was referring to is their search engine, their mail service, all of the other services are built to be reliable. When you rent a VM, they are not giving you all of those fancy bells and whistles that make your VM reliable. If the server goes down, your VM also goes down. Okay? They are not giving you that reliable service. So those are two slightly different things. Okay, good question. Okay, so we'll talk about cloud for the rest of this class, and some of this you will encounter when you do the next homework, which is going to be on cloud computing and EC2. Okay. So what does the cloud do? So cloud computing is essentially a way by which you can rent resources rather than buying resources. Very simply. Okay. So you lease rather than you buy. Okay. It has several features. Okay. You can have what is called pay as you go. Okay. You don't even have to decide how much to rent beforehand. Whatever you use over the course of a month, you get a bill based on what you have used. Okay. You can use more if your needs go up. You can use less, and the amount you pay will keep changing based on it. It's like how you get electricity from your electric company. You don't tell them a priori how many kilowatts you are going to use. You just use whatever you need and you get a bill. The same is true here. You use whatever compute and storage you need and you get a bill. Okay. It is remote. Okay. Clearly, the data center is going to be built somewhere. You have to use remote access to get to those resources, but that's okay. It is scalable because it is built on a very large data center and it is shared. Okay, that's the more very important thing. The entire data center is rented out to hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of customers that all have small pieces of the machines and storage. Okay? Some may be large customers, other may be small customers, and they are all sharing this large data center. There may be more than one, but each data center is going to be shared. Okay. Now, there are, when you talk about cloud platform, there are different types of cloud platforms. There are three layers here. So what is at the very basic type of cloud platform is called infrastructure as a service cloud. What is in the middle is called platform as a service cloud, and what's at the top is called software as a service cloud. What they differ, what is different across these three, is what is it that is being rented out to you. At the very bottom, you're essentially renting hardware. You're renting machines or storage, disks or machines. Okay? You deploy whatever software you want on it. You can even deploy whatever OS you want. You just rent a machine, you deploy your own software, and you run it. Okay, that is raw infrastructure that you're renting from a cloud provider. What's in the middle is you're renting not only hardware but a middleware platform. Okay, this is called a platform as a service. Then you simply deploy your code on that platform and you run it. Okay. You don't have to manage the OS, you don't have to manage the middleware. The cloud provider is going to do that for you. Okay. It's like you basically have rented a platform. So Google App Engine and Microsoft has Azure that allows you to do that. You can just write .NET code and simply deploy it on Azure. Okay. You don't have to actually get a machine and deploy Windows and all of the libraries and then run your code. You simply give them your application code, they run it for you. Okay. Same with Google App Engine. You can give them Python code, okay, or many other languages, but Python being the most prevalent, and they will run it for you. And what is at the very top is you rent software, okay, not just middleware, you rent end software, and you basically use that software. So simplest example is Gmail is an example of a software as a service cloud. Okay, you are renting a mail service, using mail services from Google. You don't have to manage machines, you don't have to manage middleware, you don't even have to manage the software application. You simply get a login and you use it. Okay. So in this, so you are basically, they are all different types of clouds. Okay. Here you rent hardware, middleware, there you rent end software. So Salesforce is another company that is a very popular software as a service cloud. Okay, they rent you customer management hardware, software. You use that to do CRM. Okay. So what we will do in the next lab is actually do this. You will get infrastructure as a service cloud, and you will have to do some exercises to get familiar with it. But keep in mind that there are other types of cloud. Okay. In all of these cases, and depending on how much you use, you are going to get a bill. Okay. In case of Google's mails or Gmail, for personal users is free, but there's a business version of it that you pay on a per user basis. You pay $5 a month per user, okay, for providing mail services to them. So same is true of Google App Engine. You're charged on how many requests were serviced, for instance. Okay. Here you're charged based on how many servers you rented or how many gigabytes of storage you rented every month. Okay. So that's how they're going to be built. Okay, so I'll talk about each of those three in a little more detail. So for infrastructure as a service cloud, there are many providers. Google has an infrastructure cloud, and VMware has an infrastructure cloud. IBM has one. Microsoft has one. The biggest one and the most popular one is run by Amazon, and it's called EC2, Elastic Compute Cloud. Okay, that's the acronym for it. What it allows you to do is essentially what I said. It rents. You can rent a server or some disks with storage. Okay. You can rent different kinds of servers. There are literally a dozen different configurations you can rent. So when you say I want a server, which is a virtual server, not a physical server, you have to say what type. Okay. So in the early days there were three types: small, medium, large. Small server, medium server, large server. Okay, today you have a dozen different kinds. You have extra large, extra large with lots of memory, extra large with lots of disks. So you have all kinds of combination based on what you are trying to achieve. And as the name suggests, depending on the size, you will get a server of with a different amount of resources. The smallest one, which is not even small anymore, it's called micro, which I have not even put here. This is a standard small. one core, okay, a few hundred megabytes of memory, and it costs about 2 cents an hour. Actually, 8 cents an hour. So it's about 8 cents an hour. So that's how much. So you pay by the hour. Okay, every hour you have the machine, you pay 8 cents. Okay, Google claims they are more efficient billing model. You pay by the minute. Okay, if you only rent it for 31 minutes, you'll pay for 31 minutes. Here, you will, once you rent it, you pay at least an hour minimum. So different kinds of billing model, but they roughly fall in few cents an hour. Okay, the exact configuration will decide how much you are going to pay for. This is a large one. Okay. It gives you about 32 cores. It gives you 64 GB of memory. Costs about $2 an hour. Okay. In one case, you will pay about $70 a month. In another case, you may pay a few $100s a month to rent that service. Okay. And you can rent them as many. You can rent as many as you want. You just basically make a request to the cloud, and it takes about a few minutes, and then they come back and say your machine is ready, and you can use it. Okay. So that's the provisioning time. That's an advantage of the cloud. When you say I want a machine, in a few minutes you have a machine. If you have to buy the machine, it takes you a few days. You have to go order it, it comes in, you install it, then it's ready. Here you can get it in an order of minutes, which is a big advantage for many customers. They need some urgent capacity, they have it in a matter of minutes. They don't have to wait for days for it to become available. Okay. So now storage costs about 10 cents per gigabyte per month. Also, they charge you for network bandwidth. As requests come and go to your application from the outside, you also pay for that. So you'll pay for the machine, you'll pay for the storage, and you'll pay for the amount of network bandwidth capacity you're going to use going in and coming out of the cloud. Okay. The other advanced thing you can do with Amazon is they now have data centers across the world. Okay, so they have 3 in the US, 1 in Brazil, 1 in Europe, several in Asia, 1 in Australia. So you not only say I need a server, you have to say which zone do you want it in. Do you want a European server? Do you want a Japanese one? Is it in Hong Kong? Do you want it in Virginia? So you have to specify that. And depending on which application or where your users are for your application, you have to pick the right choice. Okay, you shouldn't put your application in US if all your users are in Asia, because then they have a long latency to access it. So you may be better off deploying your server in an Asian data center. Okay, so they allow you to do this kind of have this kind of flexibility. Okay. This is an infrastructure cloud. Okay, you're simply renting servers or you're renting storage. Okay. Here is an example of platform cloud. Okay. Again, there are many examples of this. This one is a Google's App Engine cloud. Okay. Google also has an infrastructure cloud, which is a separate cloud. This is a platform cloud. So in this case, they provide you a highly scalable execution platform. What that means is you basically write your application code. Let's say it's a web application, you write it in Python. You simply deploy it on their cloud. Okay? And you don't have to worry about what kind of machine should it run on. In the infrastructure cloud, you have to say, should it run on a small machine, medium machine, large? That's application provider's decision. In the platform cloud, you simply give them the code and say, run it. Okay? And now it's the cloud provider's job to figure out how many requests are coming into this application. Okay? What type of server to run it on? Should it run it on multiple servers? All that is dealt with by the cloud provider. You don't have to worry about it. So they will scale it for you up and down as needed. Okay? So App Engine can do auto scaling. It basically can migrate your code onto bigger servers or more servers and so on. Okay. In this case, App Engine may not necessarily or is not based on virtualization. Okay. It is basically built on a middleware platform that allows you to replicate your code. And in this case, they are using a smart technique by which you can have a variable pool of worker threads that you have allocated to service requests coming into an application. As more requests come in, they scale the number of threads, so more requests can be serviced. Okay, threads can also be resident on multiple machines. Okay. Currently, this supports Java and Python, but there are other languages that other cloud providers provide. Yes.
So, when you say not based on virtualization, does that mean that, we discussed virtualization in data centers. So, I believe that that kind of virtualization will still be there. It's just that the virtualization will not be available on the operating system level or the top layer of the application. Is that so?
So platform clouds can run on infrastructure clouds where you are actually running a virtualization layer, you're deploying your machines and then running on top. Okay? But they don't have to because you are not exposing it to the customer. All the your cloud provider customers just walk in with the application code, say run. Right? Virtualization comes with some advantages, but there's also overhead of virtualization. So all that was being pointed out here is you do not need virtualization to run a platform cloud, but in most cases it may be there anyway to allow you to simplify how the virtual machine is deployed onto physical servers and so on. Okay, that's all that was being pointed out. Any other questions here? Google App Engine. Okay, so the other dimension to clouds is whether clouds are what are called public clouds or private clouds. I didn't talk about software as a service cloud, I ignored that. Just talking about a different dimension of cloud, which is a public cloud or private. So all of the cloud platforms you've seen so far are referred to as public clouds, which means that the organization that runs the cloud and the organizations that run the applications may be different. Or the people who use the cloud are different. Okay, so Amazon allows you to rent, anybody can rent machines on Amazon cloud so long as they pay the bill. Okay. Now many companies also run their own internal clouds. They are referred to as private clouds. Okay, so these are run by the IT department of that company, but for the benefit of the internal employees of the company. They are not, someone else cannot walk in and say, I want to use your cloud. And the reason for this is even within large organizations, the needs are similar as a public cloud. Okay, there may be small departments or groups within a company that may need computational resources. The old way was you need a machine, you place an order for the machine shows up, you give it to the IT department installs the machine, it's going to be ready, then you deploy your application. So the new way is the IT department runs a private cloud. Okay, you need a machine, you submit a request saying give me a virtual machine, and the software does exactly what you do in Amazon EC2 public cloud. It goes, it allocates a VM onto an idle server that is already there and you get a machine. Okay, now, so the time to get your machine has been cut down from days or weeks to hours. Okay. And when the machine is no longer needed, then you shut down the VM, the server goes back to the pool that the IT department manages. Okay, so this is basically how companies are making more efficient use of compute resources. There's a central pool of servers, okay, that are virtualized, and you can request virtual machines as and when you need and deallocate them when you don't. Okay. So this is basically a private cloud. Okay. So internal clouds run by companies. They provide the same abstraction. Okay. This provides similar flexibility. There is software that is open source or commercial that you can use to deploy your own cloud. If you have 10 machines, you can run a cloud. You can even run it on 2 machines. Okay, because it does the same thing. Once you basically have this cloud software, will manage a pool of servers. You make a request to this cloud software, it will allocate a VM. It will map it onto a physical server. Okay, it will then allow you access to it. You can deallocate it and so on and so forth. Okay. So it is all based on virtualization. So this cloud computing layer is going to manage virtual machines onto this pool of servers. Okay. So that's a private cloud. Many large companies manage their own private clouds that you don't hear about because they're internal to the organization. But the software you can just download and use and build your own if you are an organization that you want to do implement. And then there is a different model called the hybrid cloud that combines the two. Okay, there's a private cloud that is internal. Okay. Occasionally you may have a burst of demand on your private cloud. Lots of users showed up and say, give me virtual machines. You may run out of physical machines. Okay. What do you do in that case? So you can say, I'm going to order more servers and then wait for new servers to come in, add to your pool of a private cloud and then allocate your virtual machine. But then the users who are waiting may have to wait for days. They may not be happy because they are used to getting virtual machines in 5 minutes. Now they have to wait 5 days. So what you can do in that case is use some resources from the public cloud on the fly. Okay? You can what is called spill over into a public cloud whenever your private cloud becomes overloaded. Right? The private cloud can support 100 virtual machines. Occasionally you may need 110. Okay? So rather than getting extra machines and putting them here, the extra 10 you offload to a public cloud. You simply go to public cloud, get those 10 machines and give them an internal IP address and you give it to your users. Your users may not care where the machines reside in many cases. So once the need for those machines go away, you just shut them down and you're back to using your private cloud. Okay? This is referred to as a hybrid cloud model, okay, where you combine your private cloud and intelligently spill over into a public cloud very rarely when your needs are not met from the private cloud. Okay, this is techniques to do this are referred to as cloud bursting, where when you have a burst, you burst into a public cloud. Okay? So these also have to be automated to some extent. And there are techniques that allow you to automatically just go to Amazon or Google and start requesting resources when your local resources get used up. Okay? And then you can deallocate them. So you manage those two pools as if they are single logical pools. Okay. So with referred to reference to how to program, then there are many programming paradigms to build cloud applications. Okay? You can simply write your application the normal way, the client server application, and deploy it on the cloud, and it should run because any clients or the servers on the cloud are like any other servers. But there are many specialized programming models that have come up that allow you to deploy this in an easier way. Okay, in the platform as a service cloud, as I had shown you, there are special programming languages and abstractions or extensions to existing programming languages or abstractions that make it easier to write your cloud application, okay, easier to deploy those cloud applications. There are batch processing type applications that require a different way of programming. Okay. Everything I talked about so far was interactive client server style application. But a large use of the cloud is also for batch processing. You have lots of data. Okay. You want to process this data. You may need 100 machines to process it because there are lots of it. Okay. And you need it for 3 days. After that, you don't need it. You're done processing the data. Rather than buying 100 machines and keeping them every time you have such a need, you go to the cloud, rent a lot of servers, okay, give it all of the data, process it in parallel. Once it is done, you give away the servers. Okay. Very common use of cloud is for data processing in the batch mode. So there are many ways to do this. One popular way is to use this programming model called MapReduce. This allows you to do parallel processing of very large data sets using map and reduce phases. I won't talk about map reduce programming here, but this is something that is common for data intensive computing. Companies have lots of data sets. You may be a researcher who's collected a lot of data. You want to process it. You can start map reduce jobs on a cloud. Okay, rent 20, 100 machines, whatever you need, process it, bring it back. Okay, there are special ways to write these programs. Okay, in the map reduce model, there's a way to write it in any language of your choice that's supported by the platform, but it has to be written in a way that is amenable to map reduce processing, which is there's a map phase and the reduce phase. Certain operations are done in the map phase and certain in the reduce phase. Okay, that's your data processing pipeline in that case. Okay. So those are programming models. There are new ones coming up all the time, but there are some old ones that work as well. Okay. And then there are challenges I alluded to, which are just simply summarized here. Okay, one thing that I did not mention is privacy and security, which is a big challenge for many cloud providers. Okay. For one reason why companies or even users hesitate to put their data on the cloud is that they feel that they have no control over its security and privacy. Okay. If somebody breaks into that machine that is on the cloud, your data is compromised and you don't control what kind of security policies may actually be implemented by the data center provider or the cloud provider. So companies are very wary of putting sensitive data on somebody else's machine and entrusting their security to that someone else, even though that someone else may be a good, popular company like Google or Amazon. They simply don't trust them with their most sensitive data. Okay, this has been a big hurdle towards that has prevented cloud computing from becoming even more popular than it already is. Okay, because very large not very large, but very sensitive data, people don't want to put on the cloud at all. Okay, that means certain types of applications will never go onto a cloud. They will be running on their own dedicated machines, own dedicated data centers. Okay, simply because the trust model here is different. Okay, it's not your machine, it's not your data center. It may not even be your software. Well, how can you trust that person who is running all of this for you? And if it's sensitive and something bad happens, you cannot blame them. Well, you can blame them, but your loss is still your loss. Okay, they can't rectify that for you. So this is a big problem. How to enforce trust in a model where you don't own the software or the hardware. Okay? If you control everything, you know what you've done. Okay? So if you run it well, you get the credit. If you don't, you get the blame. Here, who do you blame? Right? So that's a problem. Extreme scalability, I already mentioned. How do you design systems that can manage 1 million servers in a data center? It's a complicated task to say the least. Right? There are no easy answers, but that's the kind of systems that you see being built today. Okay? And the numbers will only continue to grow as servers become smaller and more denser. Okay? So the size of these systems is continuing to grow. Okay, same with programming model. Okay, how do you write an application to run on 10 servers, 100 servers, 1000 servers as your application scales? Okay, that's not a trivial task either. Okay, because you don't know how the bottlenecks of your application will change as you go from a 10 to 100 servers, okay, or 100 to 1000 servers. Different things may become a bottleneck. The disk may become a bottleneck. The network may become a bottleneck. Your programming or threading model may become a bottleneck. So that is an important challenge for application writer. How do you write very scalable code? And it's not something that you can write without having an appreciation until you do it. Because it's not like there's a rule book that says when you write a 10 machine application, do it this way, or 100 machine application, do it some other way. Okay, it depends on the code that you write where the bottlenecks reside. Okay? So all these challenges only come up when you have this very large scale system. Something that we have not really discussed in the course of this class, but something you should be aware of. If someday you land up in one of these companies, you will actually see applications that are being written for that scale, and then you have better appreciation of how these challenges translate to reality or practice. Okay, so here are some other references that you can go look. This is an emerging area. Okay, every year the technology changes. Every year there is new ideas that are actually being looked at. Active area of research. There are many conferences where you see lots of publications on this topic. Okay, so not all answers are known. Many open questions and so on. And you can actually go read up some of these perspectives that are easy to understand, even though you may not be an expert in this area, you may not be doing research. You can at least get some appreciation of what are the challenges people are struggling with in this area. And so they should give you a flavor of designing very large scale distributed systems. These are the systems that are the largest scale, right? Other than the internet itself, right? As far as a distributed system goes, these are the systems that are as big as they get, the data centers and cloud systems of today. Okay. So I have a few minutes. I can see if there are any questions. Otherwise, we will end it a little early. Okay, yes.
So we learned about different kinds of virtualizations, like hypervisor one, two, virtualization and all. So currently in the cloud computing space, what kind of virtualization do you use? Like, hypervisor one or the virtualization? I guess because these are the two options that I see that are being used.
Yeah, so in most cloud or data center environments, you will use server virtualization, which means you are not going to use more type 2 virtualization, which is meant for desktops. And whether it is type 1 or para virtualization depends on the cloud. Okay, and even within the same provider, you may actually see different ones. Okay, some of Amazon's machines early on used to be para virtualized. Some later ones just use type 1 virtualization. Okay, so you will see a combination of those two. And Microsoft may make different decisions for its cloud than what Google may use and so on. But the one thing that is you can say for sure is there will be some server virtualization technique, which means either type 1 or para virtualization is probably the most common scenario. Type 2 you will typically not see in this scenarios.
So, when we look at when we go to EC2, so they generally also provide their own flavor of Ubuntu of their Linux systems. So, are they like uh, para-virtualized operating systems, or they are just
Okay, so question is, when you get a machine from Amazon, they give their own distribution. Okay, so I will say that the distribution that the default ones they provide is simply for convenience. You can deploy your own. Okay, they are not para virtualized. They're simple distributions that from which you create what are called machine images or virtual disks that are ready to deploy. Okay. So you do not have to use theirs. You can actually go with your. So you can simply take Ubuntu or whatever Linux distribution you want, or even Windows. You can create a virtual disk. You can use a tool to convert it into Amazon what's called an Amazon machine image, which is their form of a virtual disk. Upload it to their cloud and say, now I want a VM with my own distribution, and they will then use that distribution to boot up your machine. They simply provide you some default values for convenience, so you don't have to go and make your own virtual disk. There's nothing to prevent you from doing that. Okay, and the other way answer to your question is they don't need to be para-virtualized in this case. They're simple virtual machines that you constructed that are just built to be deployed on the cloud. In fact, in the next homework, you will make your own image and boot it. Yeah, the cloud computing homework that we have. You start with the default, but then you'll modify it and boot off it, so you get a better flavor for what it is. Any other questions here? Okay, so there's an exam on Thursday for those of you who didn't see this. Okay, so I already sent a mail. It's lecture 1 through 14. It's going to be in this room at 6, okay, on Thursday. It's closed book, closed notes. I put up a sample exam already. If you have questions about any aspect of the class material, come see me. Okay, I'm here the whole week, office hours and so on. Okay, you can even come outside of office hours if that's not convenient.